Welcome. Today we look back at one of the most defining events in human history, World War II. This was a conflict that reshaped nations, transformed societies, and changed the role of the United States in the world forever. What follows is not a story of heroes and villains alone, but a record of decisions, sacrifices, and consequences that continue to shape our present. This is the story of World War II. The American soldier arrives in war. When the United States entered World War II, American soldiers did not march into Europe or the Pacific as conquerors. They arrived as newcomers to a war that had already been raging for years. They were young, inexperienced, and about to face enemies who had survived campaigns across continents. The reputation of the American infantry had not yet been earned. It would be forged slowly, painfully, and at extraordinary cost. Most American soldiers were civilians only months earlier. Factory workers, farmers, clerks, students. The draft transformed everyday life almost overnight. Training camps filled with men learning how to wear uniforms, march in formation, and fire weapons they had never touched before. Training was intense but limited by time. The war demanded speed, not perfection. American doctrine emphasized firepower and mobility, but early in the war, much of that existed only in theory. Soldiers trained with rifles, machine guns, mortars, and grenades, but few understood what combat truly meant. Instructors could teach technique, but fear could not be simulated. That lesson would come later. Uniforms and equipment became part of identity. The M1 helmet, steel and heavy, became the symbol of the American soldier. The M1 Garand rifle, semi-automatic and reliable, gave American infantry an advantage in fire rate over many enemies. Web gear carried ammunition, first aid kits, and personal items that reminded soldiers of home. These were not decorations. They were survival tools. American soldiers entered the war in multiple theaters. In North Africa, they faced German troops hardened by years of combat. In the Pacific, they confronted an enemy that refused surrender and fought from jungle, caves, and fortified islands. In both cases, the learning curve was brutal. The first engagements were shocking. Units broke under pressure. Communications failed. Leaders were killed early. Some soldiers froze. Others reacted with uncontrolled aggression. Combat revealed weaknesses that training had not exposed. But it also revealed resilience. American units adapted faster than expected. Mistakes were studied. Tactics were revised. Leaders were replaced when necessary. Fear was universal. American soldiers learned quickly that courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to function despite it. Men learned to move under fire, to trust their squad, and to rely on drills when thinking became impossible. Survival depended on discipline and mutual support more than individual heroics. Losses mounted. Friends disappeared suddenly, often without explanation. Soldiers learned not to ask too many questions. There was no time. The unit moved forward, or it died where it stood. Medical evacuation improved survival rates, but many wounded never returned. Death became routine, even as it remained unbearable. American infantry units developed a distinct culture. Slang, dark humor, and shared misery created bonds stronger than anything soldiers had known before. Rank mattered less in combat than competence. A reliable sergeant mattered more than distant officers. Trust was earned in seconds and broken instantly. By late 1942 and 1943, American soldiers were no longer raw recruits. They were veterans. Not because they wanted to be, but because they had survived long enough to learn. The American infantryman was changing, from inexperienced participant to hardened fighter. The war would take them further, onto beaches, into cities, through forests, mountains, jungles, and ruins. Each step forward would demand more endurance than the last. This is the story of the American soldier on the ground, not the generals, not the machines, the men who advanced one step at a time and paid for every meter. Baptism of fire, first battles, and hard lessons. The first real battles fought by American soldiers in World War II shattered any remaining illusions about combat. Training had prepared them to march, shoot, and follow orders, but it could not prepare them for the chaos, fear, and sudden violence of the battlefield. The moment bullets started flying, theory disappeared. Survival became the only objective. For many American soldiers, this baptism of fire came in North Africa. In late 1942 and early 1943, U.S. forces faced German troops who were disciplined, experienced, and confident. Early engagements revealed painful weaknesses. Units were poorly coordinated. Communication between infantry, armor, and artillery was inconsistent. Some officers lacked combat experience and hesitated under pressure. German forces exploited these mistakes quickly. The Battle of Kasserine Pass became a turning point. American units were outmaneuvered and driven back, suffering heavy losses. Equipment was abandoned. Morale collapsed in places. For many soldiers, it was their first experience of defeat. Yet Kasserine also forced the U.S. Army to confront reality. Leadership was evaluated ruthlessly. Ineffective commanders were removed. Training methods were revised. The Army learned that adaptation was not optional. In the Pacific, first combat experiences were even more brutal. American soldiers fought an enemy that refused surrender and used terrain as a weapon. Jungle warfare erased visibility. Heat, disease, and exhaustion weakened men before combat even began. Japanese forces fought from hidden positions, launching surprise attacks at close range. American soldiers learned quickly that hesitation meant death. Weapons and equipment mattered enormously in these early battles. The M1 Garand gave American infantry a higher rate of fire, often saving lives in close combat. The BR provided mobile firepower at squad level. Grenades, flamethrowers, and mortars became essential tools for clearing enemy positions. Soldiers learned to rely on these weapons instinctively, often without conscious thought. Fear became constant. The sound of incoming artillery, the crack of rifle fire, and the sudden explosion of grenades conditioned soldiers rapidly. Men learned to distinguish sounds: the whistle of incoming shells, the thud of mortars, the snap of nearby bullets. These sounds dictated movement. A mistake in judgment could be fatal. Casualties came fast. Soldiers watched friends fall without warning. Medics worked under fire, often risking their own lives to pull wounded men to safety. Not everyone could be saved. American medical evacuation systems were better than most, but battlefield reality was unforgiving. The sight of wounded and dead became a daily reality that soldiers learned to endure without becoming numb. Small unit leadership proved decisive. Squads and platoons survived based on the competence of sergeants and junior officers. Clear orders, calm voices, and decisive action mattered more than rank. Soldiers learned quickly who could be trusted. Leaders who froze were ignored or replaced in practice, if not officially. Combat sorted men faster than any training program. American soldiers also learned to fight together. Lone bravery meant little without coordination. Covering fire, movement by bounds, and mutual support became habits. Units that communicated and trusted each other survived longer. Those that did not were destroyed. By the end of their first campaigns, American soldiers were no longer the same men who had arrived fresh from training camps. They had learned through failure and loss. Confidence grew, but it was cautious and grounded in experience. They understood now that victory would not be quick or clean. The baptism of fire was over. The learning had begun, and the next battles would demand even more, because the American soldier was about to be tested not only by the enemy, but by the terrain, the weather, and the grinding reality of prolonged war. Weapons, gear, and survival on the ground. For the American soldier, survival in World War II depended not only on courage or leadership, but on the tools carried into battle. Weapons, uniforms, and basic gear were not accessories. They were the thin line between life and death. As combat experience accumulated, soldiers learned which equipment could be trusted and which mistakes would get them killed. The defining weapon reminder of the American infantryman was the M1 Garand. Semi-automatic, rugged, and reliable, it gave U.S. soldiers a decisive advantage in rate of fire. In firefights, American troops could deliver sustained fire, while enemies using bolt-action rifles were forced to pause and reload. Soldiers learned to fire quickly, adjust aim instinctively, and keep pressure on the enemy. The distinctive metallic sound of an empty Garand clip ejecting became part of battlefield memory, sometimes a warning, sometimes irrelevant in the chaos of combat. Supporting weapons shaped how squads fought. The BR provided mobile automatic fire, allowing squads to suppress enemy positions while others maneuvered. Thompson submachine guns and later M3 submachine guns were valued in close-quarters fighting, especially in towns, forests, and jungles. Grenades became essential for clearing bunkers, rooms, and trenches. Soldiers learned to carry them where they could be reached instantly, because hesitation was fatal. In the Pacific, specialized equipment became critical. Flamethrowers were among the most feared and necessary tools, used to clear caves and fortified positions that could not be neutralized by small arms alone. Operators knew they were prime targets. Carrying a flamethrower meant drawing enemy fire immediately, yet these weapons saved countless lives by ending resistance quickly, where prolonged fighting would have cost more. Uniforms and protective gear reflected the harsh environments American soldiers faced. The M1 steel helmet became an icon, offering limited but vital protection against shrapnel and debris. It did not stop rifle bullets, but it saved lives daily by deflecting fragments. Soldiers learned never to remove it in combat, even when heat or exhaustion made it unbearable. Web gear carried ammunition, first aid supplies, and personal items. Overloading was a constant problem. Soldiers wanted to be prepared for everything, but too much weight slowed movement and increased fatigue. Veterans quickly learned to strip gear down to essentials. What mattered was mobility, not comfort. Boots were a constant concern. Marching, fighting, and sleeping in wet conditions destroyed feet faster than enemy fire. Trench foot, blisters, and infections sidelined thousands. Soldiers learned to dry socks whenever possible and to protect their feet obsessively. A soldier who could not walk was a liability to himself and his unit. Medical gear and training saved lives. Every soldier carried a basic first aid kit and learned to treat wounds immediately. Tourniquets, bandages, and morphine syrettes were used under fire. Medics became some of the most respected figures in units, running toward gunfire to reach the wounded. Survival rates improved dramatically because American medical evacuation systems moved casualties quickly from the front to aid stations and hospitals. Experience taught soldiers how to use terrain. Foxholes were dug instinctively whenever units stopped. Cover and concealment were understood differently. Trees did not stop bullets. Walls could collapse. Ground offered the best protection. Soldiers learned to read terrain quickly, choosing positions that offered protection and escape routes. Maintenance became survival. Weapons were cleaned obsessively, even in combat zones. Dirt, sand, and moisture caused jams that could be fatal. Soldiers learned to trust their weapons only as much as they trusted their own discipline in caring for them. Over time, gear became an extension of the soldier's body. Hands reached for weapons without conscious thought. Movements were economical and practiced. Panic gave way to routine under fire. Equipment that worked earned loyalty. Equipment that failed was discarded or modified. American soldiers were not equipped perfectly, but they were equipped adaptively. Feedback from the front reached factories and depots. Gear improved as the war continued. What mattered most was that soldiers learned how to survive with what they had. Weapons and gear did not make American soldiers invincible, but they gave them a fighting chance. And in World War II, that was often enough. Beaches, cities, and forests, fighting across different battlefields. American soldiers in World War II did not fight on a single kind of battlefield. They were thrown into environments that demanded completely different skills, instincts, and forms of endurance. A man who survived one theater often had to relearn how to fight in the next. The enemy changed, but the ground itself became one of the most dangerous opponents. The first shock for many soldiers came on the beaches. Amphibious landings were chaos by design. At places like Normandy, soldiers stepped out of landing craft into surf, smoke, and gunfire. Heavy equipment dragged men underwater. Units were scattered immediately. Officers were often killed in the first minutes. There was no clear front line, only open sand, obstacles, and incoming fire. Survival on the beach depended on movement. Soldiers learned quickly that staying still meant dying. They crawled, ran, and stumbled forward using shell craters, wreckage, and bodies as cover. Training dissolved into instinct. Small groups formed around whoever was still alive and able to lead. The objective was simple: get off the beach or be killed on it. Once inland, cities presented a new nightmare. Urban combat erased visibility and distance. Streets became funnels of fire. Buildings hid snipers, machine guns, and booby traps. American soldiers learned that walls did not mean safety. Doors and windows were death traps. Clearing a building meant grenades first, then controlled movement room by room. Urban fighting required discipline and patience. Units advanced slowly, covering every angle. Communication was difficult. Noise echoed. Dust and smoke filled the air. Civilians were often present, terrified and trapped. Soldiers had to distinguish threats instantly. Mistakes were irreversible. In forests, especially in places like the Ardennes, combat became intimate and unpredictable. Trees blocked sight lines. Artillery bursts shredded branches, sending splinters flying like shrapnel. German units used camouflage and ambush tactics effectively. American soldiers learned to scan constantly, listening as much as watching. A single snap or whisper could mean an enemy was close. Weather made forests worse. Rain turned ground to mud. Snow amplified cold and slowed movement. During the Battle of the Bulge, American soldiers fought in freezing conditions with limited winter gear. Frostbite incapacitated thousands. Digging foxholes in frozen ground was exhausting and sometimes impossible. Soldiers slept in wet uniforms, conserving heat any way they could. In the Pacific, terrain was even more unforgiving. Jungles swallowed sound and sight. Heat and humidity exhausted men rapidly. Disease spread easily. Japanese forces fought from hidden positions, launching sudden attacks at close range. American soldiers learned to expect danger everywhere, behind trees, under roots, inside caves. Caves and bunkers required specialized tactics. Grenades, flamethrowers, and demolitions were used to clear positions that could not be assaulted directly. These fights were personal and brutal. There was no room for distance or hesitation. Survival depended on coordination and trust in the man beside you. Across all terrains, American soldiers adapted. What worked on a beach failed in a city. What worked in a forest failed in a jungle. Units that survived learned to read their environment quickly and change behavior without hesitation. This adaptability became a defining trait of American infantry. The enemy mattered, but the battlefield shaped how the enemy fought. American soldiers learned that victory was not about mastering one type of combat, but about surviving many kinds at once. Every new landscape demanded new lessons. Every lesson was paid for in blood. And as the war continued, American soldiers were forced to fight not only different terrains, but increasingly determined and desperate enemies. Leadership, brotherhood, and fighting for the man next to you. As the war dragged on, American soldiers learned that survival depended less on grand strategy and more on the people immediately around them. Leadership in combat was not about rank alone. It was about competence under fire, clarity in chaos, and the ability to keep moving when fear threatened to paralyze everyone. Brotherhood, earned through shared danger, became the strongest motivation to fight. At the small unit level, sergeants and junior officers mattered most. Lieutenants fresh from training often learned quickly or did not survive long. Enlisted leaders who had seen combat understood how to read terrain, when to advance, and when to take cover. They spoke plainly, gave short orders, and led from the front. Soldiers followed leaders who proved they would not waste lives. Those who hesitated or exposed their men unnecessarily lost authority immediately. Combat created a brutal meritocracy. A man's value was measured by reliability under pressure. Could he return fire accurately? Could he carry a wounded soldier? Could he hold a position when ordered? Courage was respected, but steadiness was prized more. Panic endangered everyone. Calm saved lives. Over time, units developed an unspoken hierarchy based on trust rather than insignia. Brotherhood formed quickly and deeply. Men shared foxholes, rations, cigarettes, and fear. They learned each other's habits, strengths, and weaknesses. Jokes were dark. Humor was sharp. Laughter often followed danger, not because it was funny, but because it released tension. Bonds formed that were stronger than anything soldiers had known before. Fighting became personal, not for flags or speeches, but for the man next to you. This brotherhood shaped behavior in battle. Soldiers took risks to retrieve wounded comrades. Medics ran into fire without hesitation. Riflemen covered each other instinctively. When a unit suffered losses, the survivors felt the absence immediately. Empty places in formation were noticed. Names were spoken less often. New replacements arrived, but trust took time. Veterans watched newcomers closely, teaching them quietly, hoping they would learn fast enough. Leadership also meant managing fear. American soldiers did not stop being afraid. They learned to function while afraid. Leaders acknowledged fear without dwelling on it. Orders were framed simply: move to that tree, cover that sector, hold until relieved. Breaking the battle into manageable tasks kept men focused. Long-term thinking had no place under fire. Communication was critical and fragile. Radios failed. Runners were killed. Hand signals and shouted commands filled the gaps. Confusion was constant. Effective leaders repeated orders and ensured understanding before moving. In the chaos of combat, a misunderstood command could be fatal. The pressure of prolonged combat tested even strong units. Exhaustion eroded patience. Small disagreements became serious. Leaders had to recognize when units needed rest or relief. Rotation systems were imperfect, but commanders learned that pushing men beyond limits resulted in collapse, not heroism. Survival required pacing as much as aggression. American soldiers also learned to trust supporting arms. Artillery, tanks, engineers, and air support became part of the brotherhood in a broader sense. Infantry learned to coordinate with these elements, calling for fire when pinned down and advancing when support arrived. Victory was increasingly collective, not individual. By late war, American units operated with a quiet confidence. They were not reckless. They were efficient. Orders were followed without hesitation because trust existed. Trust in leaders, trust in training, trust in each other. This cohesion allowed American forces to absorb losses, adapt tactics, and continue advancing under relentless pressure. Brotherhood did not remove grief. Soldiers mourned losses privately, often silently. There was rarely time for ceremony. The unit moved on because it had to. Carrying the memory of fallen comrades became part of the burden each survivor carried. In the end, American soldiers did not fight because they loved war. They fought because someone had to. And they fought hardest, not for abstract ideals, but for the men who shared their danger, their exhaustion, and their hope of surviving another day. The war would demand even more from them. The final battles were approaching, and they would test everything American soldiers had learned. The final battles: endurance, desperation, and the road to victory. By late 1944 and into 1945, American soldiers entered the most demanding phase of the war. The enemy was weakening, but the fighting grew more desperate. German units pushed back across Europe, defended cities, rivers, and roads, with determination born from knowing there was nowhere left to retreat. In the Pacific, Japanese forces fought with an intensity that increased as defeat became inevitable. For American soldiers, the final battles were not easier. They were harsher. In Western Europe, the advance toward Germany exposed infantry to constant danger. River crossings became focal points of resistance. Bridges were destroyed, forcing assaults under fire. Engineers worked at night to build temporary crossings while infantry secured the banks. Artillery fire was heavy and precise. Urban combat intensified as Allied forces moved into towns and cities that had been turned into fortresses. Each street, cellar, and stairwell had to be cleared. The Battle of the Bulge tested endurance like nothing before. Winter conditions were brutal. Snow, ice, and freezing temperatures weakened men faster than bullets. Many soldiers lacked proper winter clothing. Frostbite incapacitated thousands. Supplies were scarce. Units were surrounded and cut off. Communication failed. Yet American soldiers held. Small units defended road junctions and villages against repeated attacks. When weather cleared, support arrived. but survival had already been decided by endurance. In the Pacific, the final island battles, Iwo Jima and Okinawa, were among the bloodiest of the entire war. American soldiers faced an enemy that used terrain ruthlessly. Caves, tunnels, and fortified positions turned every advance into a deadly puzzle. Japanese forces refused surrender, forcing Americans to clear positions one by one. Flamethrowers, demolitions, and grenades became essential tools. Progress was measured in yards, not miles. Casualties mounted rapidly. Medics worked under constant fire. Evacuation was difficult. The wounded often lay exposed for hours before being reached. Soldiers learned to function despite exhaustion, fear, and loss. The pace of combat left little time for reflection. Survival required constant attention to immediate threats. Leadership was stretched to its limits. Officers and sergeants were killed frequently, forcing rapid replacement in the middle of combat. Junior leaders took command instinctively. Orders became simpler. Objectives were narrowed. The focus was not on sweeping maneuvers, but on holding ground and moving forward one position at a time. American soldiers also faced moral strain. As they entered enemy territory, they encountered destroyed cities, displaced civilians, and evidence of atrocities. The reality of what the war had become was impossible to ignore. Discipline mattered. Leaders worked to prevent breakdowns in order, understanding that uncontrolled violence would undermine everything they had fought for. Despite the pressure, American units continued to adapt. Combined arms coordination improved. Infantry worked closely with tanks, engineers, artillery, and air support. When one element stalled, another compensated. This flexibility allowed advances to continue even under severe resistance. The final months demanded patience as much as courage. Soldiers learned that rushing often meant dying. They advanced carefully, cleared methodically, and rested when possible. The enemy's desperation made him dangerous, but it also revealed his limits. Supplies ran out. Reinforcements failed to arrive. Resistance collapsed unevenly. By the spring of 1945, American soldiers were pushing into the heart of enemy territory. The war's end was visible, but not guaranteed. Every town taken, every ridge cleared, every cave sealed, brought them closer. Victory was no longer a question of if, but of how many would survive to see it. The final battles did not create heroes in the cinematic sense. They created survivors, men who endured conditions few could imagine and continued moving forward because stopping was not an option. And as the fighting slowed and then stopped, American soldiers were left with something they had not had for years: silence. After the fighting, survival, return, and the cost of coming home. When the fighting finally stopped, many American soldiers discovered that surviving the war was only the beginning of another struggle. The silence that followed combat felt unnatural. After months or years of constant danger, the absence of gunfire left a vacuum that was difficult to fill. Soldiers who had lived by routine, urgency, and shared risk now faced uncertainty of a different kind. In Europe, surrender came suddenly. Units that had been preparing for the next assault were ordered to stand down. Weapons were unloaded. Guard duty replaced combat patrols. Soldiers moved through towns and cities that had just days earlier been battlefields. Civilians emerged cautiously from cellars and ruins. For many Americans, this was the first moment when the scale of destruction became fully visible. Entire neighborhoods were gone, infrastructure was shattered, millions were displaced. In the Pacific, the war ended even more abruptly. After the announcement of Japan's surrender, soldiers who had expected to fight an invasion of the home islands were suddenly told the war was over. Relief was immediate, but it was mixed with disbelief. Many had mentally prepared themselves for even greater losses. The end felt unreal, as if it could be reversed at any moment. Demobilization began quickly, but not smoothly. Soldiers were processed in stages, often waiting months before returning home. During this time, they performed occupation duties, guarded prisoners, distributed supplies, and helped restore basic order. The nature of service changed, but the war's imprint did not fade. Men still woke at night to imagined sounds. Sudden noises triggered reflexive reactions. Habits formed in combat lingered. Returning home brought its own challenges. Families expected reunion and celebration. Communities held parades and ceremonies. Yet many soldiers found it difficult to explain what they had experienced. The language of civilian life felt inadequate to describe fear measured in seconds, or the loss of friends who had been standing beside them only moments before. Many chose silence rather than explanation. Psychological wounds were poorly understood at the time. What would later be recognized as combat stress or trauma had no clear name or treatment. Some veterans struggled with anger, withdrawal, or restlessness. Others threw themselves into work or education, using activity to quiet memories. Many carried their experiences quietly, believing that speaking about them would burden others. Physical injuries were more visible, but even they did not capture the full cost. Men returned with scars, missing limbs, and chronic pain. Hospitals and rehabilitation centers were overwhelmed. Prosthetics improved rapidly, but recovery was long and uncertain. For some, the war never truly ended. Despite these challenges, American veterans reshaped the post-war world. Educational programs allowed millions to attend college. Skills learned in the military translated into industry, construction, engineering, and leadership roles. Veterans became the backbone of post-war economic growth. Their discipline, adaptability, and resilience influenced a generation. Yet beneath this success lay memory. Reunions brought former comrades together, often decades later. Names of the fallen were spoken softly. Stories resurfaced in fragments. Time had passed, but the bonds remained strong. Survivors carried a sense of responsibility to remember those who did not return. The cost of coming home was not measured in headlines or medals. It was measured in a World War II reshaped the world we live in today. Its victories, losses, and lessons remind us of the cost of global conflict and the value of cooperation. By remembering this history, we honor those who lived through it and better understand the world they left behind. Thank you for watching, and thank you for remembering.